So Frozen recently released their brand new RPG resin, and I figured what better way to test it out than by printing off some snowy orcs that are riding dinosaurs that are stuck in a blizzard. Now, this project's been brought to you by Frozen, who very kindly sponsored this video and also sent over the resin for me to use. And yeah, they helped me to do some mad random things. Now recently, or maybe not so recently, I did some ice casts. So I took my old Stormcast Eternals that I'd never done anything with, and I turned them into Ice Warriors. And at some point very soon in the future, I'm going to be doing this video where I'm teaching kids how to paint and basically how to teach the parents, how to teach the kids. It's like it just keeps on going on. And one of my son's friends noticed the ice cast and he wants to paint up some ice warriors. So I figured, why don't I paint up some ice orcs for him to fight? And it's gonna be, just lots of fun. So these are by Artisan Guild, and I basically got them all downloaded and then thrown onto my printer. So the printer I'm using for this project is the Frozen Sonic Mega 8KS, which is a beast of a machine, and it just lets me get everything thrown on there. Considering I'm printing off this big old T-Rex, I needed something pretty big to get it on there. Even though it's cut up into nice small pieces, it just makes it a little bit easy. So I got everything printed and then thrown onto the wash station, gave them all a good wash in my double dip. So I used 2 different wash stations, one with a dirty dip and then one with a clean dip of alcohol. That gets them nice and clean. And then we'll move over onto the curing. And once they're nice washed and cured, it's time to get them painted. Now I wasn't sure how I was going to do all of these because I had the big old beastie that needs to get done. And in the last video, I went with my airbrush and I got loads of things done there. But for this one, I decided just to use an Army Painter rattle can that I had lying around. I had this old crystal blue that I just have never used, and I figured that would make a decent enough base. So I got them all sprayed and primed in this crystal blue and then let that set for a little while. And then it was over to the painting table. Next stage was just a dry brush of white. So basically picking it all out and getting some really bright whites all over it. And go mad at this stage. You really want to kind of hammer it home. It might seem like you're doing too much, but you want to do that because ideally what you want is all of that blue to be a really nice shadow underneath it, and then a bit of a transition to, well, not even a transition, you want quite a stark white on the top because it's going to help you pick out all the highlights and just add to that icy snowiness. Once that was done, I was really stuck because with my ice cast, I'd done basically everything in blue with a couple of tints of green all over. But for these, I want them to have a little bit more color and a little bit more difference. But then I also didn't want to ruin everything that I was doing beneath it with that like priming stage. So I went with blue orcs. I was going to have blue armor and like green flesh. And then I was going to have like blue armor and white flesh, but I went for blue flesh. So for this, I've used basically Citadel contrast paints for the whole lot of this. There's only a couple of things where I didn't, and I'll let you know what those are. So for the skin, I used Frost Heart and I sloshed this all over. And again, this is a really nice deep blue that matches that crystal blue that I'd already used for the base, but it helps to retint all of that white stuff that you've got over the top of it. It's quite thin as well. So when it comes to contrast paint, some of them are really thick and they're basically like using a normal layer paint. Some are like a wash, and this comes quite close to a wash. So you can pop it over it and you still get all those highlights you've got from doing the dry brush stage. Once that was done, I picked out all the leather parts on it. So things like they've got the loincloths on there. There's a couple of bits that's got like leather on the greaves as well. And there's some bits on the weapons as well. They've got leather straps around them. And I used Volupus Pink for this one, which is a nice browny pink, but it's nice and bright. And I probably have used too many colors on this. So there's a lot of colors that draw the eye because you've got your bright blues, there's a lot of white on there, there's greens, which we're going to come on to in a moment, and obviously pinks as well. But I like it. I think it worked quite nicely. So next up was the metals. And my original idea for this was that I was going to do all blue flesh and then really bright white armor with like really deep blues. But then I decided against that and I went with Hex-Ray Flame. And this is this nice green. That's the only way to describe it. It's like a plasmatic type green. And again, like I mentioned, you've got some that are like a layer paint and some that are almost like a wash. And Hex-Ray Flame is quite a thin paint. So when you put it over the top of it, again, you're getting all of those deeps underneath it and you're getting all the highlights on top of it as well. And because you've got that blue going through the whole thing and it's all undercoated in blue, that still seeps through it as well. So you're still getting that really nice cold tone. Once that was done, I had some extra leather bits. So like on the T-Rex, on his tail, he's got all these ropes, which isn't leather. I realize that as I say it now. And also on like the weapons and the wood and anything like that. And I went with Snakebite Leather, again, another contrast paint. I really like this one for woods and for ropes and leathers and stuff like that. And then I needed to figure out the magical bits. And I wanted the magic to be warm because everything else is quite cold on these models. Maybe apart from the Volupus Pink, which is kind of warm, but I wanted to have something else that was really nice and warm and bright on there. And with my ice casts, I believe I used like a really cold green to make the magic work, which is nice because the whole model is really cold. But with these, I want them to be a little bit different. So I went with Bile Red for this. Again, another contrast paint. And this is like the complete flip side to Hexray Flame and stuff like that, because it's a really thick paint and it goes on pretty much onto anything in one coat. It's a beautiful paint. If you like reds and you like painting with red, pick up some contrast paint Bile Red. It's really, really good. So pop this on there to do the magic, and then I left it there and moved on to the next stage. Next up was making up a wash. So for the T-Rex, he was very cold. He was just a big old blue thing, which isn't necessarily bad, but it meant that everything was just icy and cold. And I figured around his mouth, for example, it's got all these fleshy bits that are on show. And then you've got all these big old icy scales on top. And in my head, I wanted it to be a little bit different. So you've got all the fleshy bits that are underneath the scale and like under the belly and underneath the tail. And I wanted to get them like a reddy pink type color, but I didn't want to have a really hard cutoff. Now, normally for this, I would use an oil wash, but I figured I'm gonna be lazy and I didn't want to mix up an oil wash. So instead I went with some Doomfire Magenta and I really thinned this down. So again, it's another contrast paint and I threw so much water and medium into this to really, really thin it down. So it was a really nice wash. I then started to put it around things like the lips and the mouth and around the teeth, under the belly, under the tail, just anywhere where there weren't scales to really kind of bring it out. And I feel like this worked really, really nicely. Now, if you're looking at this as you start to go through it yourself and you're doing something similar, it might look like you've got a bit of a hard line between like the scales or the legs. The one bit in particular was on the legs where it almost looked like you had this line going through it and it looked very obviously painted on. But that kind of gets fixed when we come on to the next stage, so don't worry too much about it. So speaking of that next stage, leave everything to dry because you've been using some contrast paints here. If you thinned them down as well like I did in terms of that Doomfire Magenta, then you definitely need to let that dry because otherwise it's going to turn it into a mess. And then we go back in with a dry brush of white. Now you want to be quite sparing with this. Don't go in with too heavy of a dry brush like you did at the start because otherwise you're going to undo everything that you did. But this just helps you to pick out some of those highlights. And again, because we're working with really cold colors and models and everything else, it just helps to really add some of that cold iciness back in there. And the other thing that I found that was quite nice, and I probably didn't leave the Doomfire Magenta long enough, but it turned this really nice highlight and it blended it between the blues and the whites down to that pink. I think it adds a really nice transition there and just brings the whole thing together. Once you're done with your dry brush and take it to whatever stage that you like, you can make it as cold as you like, you can add in some extra highlights with that dry brush as well. But then I went back in just with the brush and some white paint and I just popped that on there as well. So things like the hair, I wanted all the hair to be white, so I added some more white in there just to really make it white. Some extra highlights as well on points of the armor and stuff like that. Anywhere where you want that white, pop it in there. Whilst you're doing this stage, make sure you get the teeth as well, so you want to kind of pick those out and get the eyes. So we'll move on to that next, but get all the eyes done in white at this stage and then we can move on to the next bit. So now you've done your whites and all your highlights, I went back in there with some Bad Moon Yellow and I dropped that into the eyes. And I like doing this with eyes. You just do them white first, let it dry, and then use a contrast or a speed paint and drop it into the eyes, and it just makes it so much easier. If you use a traditional paint, at least in my experience, the whole face is going to end up covered in the wrong color, whereas this seems to work well for me. It's the same thing with the teeth as well. They've all now been done in white, so I then went back in there with some Yandan Yellow and I popped that on top of it as well. And that just gives it a more of a, like a dirty yellow. So the Bad Moon Yellow is a really bright yellow, and then the Yandan Yellow is like this more dirty yellow, so that just makes the teeth look a little bit different. Moving on to the final bit of the painting stage at least, I used some Nuln oil and I basically pin washed this into different areas I wanted it. So like the separation between the skin and the armor, I made sure I got some in there to add some shadow and a bit more stark separation. Around the eyes as well, I got some in there, around the hair and the top of the head. All of that stuff. Anywhere where I wanted a bit more of a stark separation between the two colors, I got some of that in there. I kind of cheated with the hair because I didn't actually add that much white on there, but I went back in and I used a lot more of the Nuln oil anywhere where that white was already. And that kind of adds a lot more shadow in and black separation between what it's on and then the white on top of it, which gives it a really nice contrast between really dark to white, which lends itself to the iciness, but also lends itself to the white. And it's also a bit of a speed hack that I used because I was being lazy at this stage. Now, once we're done with that, it was moving over onto the snowy bit. Now, with my ice cast, I went crazy with this and I added like icicles and I added loads of snow on there, but I wanted these orcs to be a bit more natural. They're not animated from ice. They're just living in an icy environment to have a fight with the ice cast people. So I mixed up my usual mix for snow, which is basically this Army Painter snow mix, and then throwing in some watered down PVA. You do that, and then you slosh it onto the bases, and you're pretty much golden at this stage. And once that was done, I used a nice satin varnish through the airbrush, rimmed the bases black, and we were golden. I really like the way these have turned out. And the frozen RPG resin is really good quality. And it's really flexible as well, which is a bonus when it comes to things like this. That way all those little fiddly weapons and stuff, if you knock it or you drop it, they're not gonna break, which is always a nice to have. I think the quality of these looks absolutely fantastic. I'm really happy with the way they've turned out. And let me know in the comments, would you do anything different? Do you like the stages? Do you think the abundance of colors works, or does it detract from the models? I'm still not sold on it. I really like it, but I'm also very conscious that there's a lot of colors on there and they're all doing different things. But yeah, I really like it. So thanks so much to Frozen for sponsoring this video. If you want to find these files as well, they're by Artisan Guild, and you can find them over on their Patreon or on the My Mini Factory. And yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Thanks so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one. Take care. Bye.